I sat at the head of the walnut conference table staring at the faces of people I once called my family. The room held a dead, suffocating silence, the kind that settles in right before everything explodes. The air conditioning droned somewhere in the background, but all I could register was the steady thud of my own heartbeat. My wife's funeral had barely grown cold, and already the scavengers were swooping down on me. My daughter-in-law Serena leaned across the table, both palms pressed flat against the polished surface. She bore no resemblance to a grieving relative. She looked like a hunter who had just run her prey into a wall. She brought a thick stack of legal documents crashing down onto the table, the slap of paper cutting through the silence like a blade. Her smile was ice-cold, pure contempt, dressed up as confidence. "Now that the old woman is gone," she said, her voice laced with poison, "you will sign the company over to my son and go take care of yourself. You are finished here, Gerald. This belongs to us now." I turned to look at my son Colin seated right there beside her. His eyes were fixed on his expensive shoes. He hadn't the spine to lift his gaze and meet his father's. They were convinced they had me pinned. They genuinely believed that a grieving man of 70 made for easy prey. But they had forgotten the one thing that mattered most who had built the empire they were so eager to plunder. I did not raise my voice. I did not push back. I simply smiled, laced my fingers together, and let the silence stretch. Exactly 3 seconds later, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. My lawyer, Warren Aldrich, strode into the room without a word of greeting. He walked directly to the table and laid a certified DNA test down in front of Serena. To understand how we arrived at that moment in that charged boardroom, you have to travel back exactly 3 days. The sweet scent of funeral lilies still hung thick in the air throughout my home. My Evelyn was gone. 45 years of a beautiful marriage cut down by pancreatic cancer over the course of a few brutal months. The house had gone painfully quiet, empty in a way that pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. I stood alone at the kitchen sink, letting warm water run over my hands as I rinsed a simple drinking glass. Welcome back to Dad Revenge. Glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along so you never miss what comes next. While you're settling in, I'd love to know, what are you up to right now as you listen? Driving somewhere, cooking dinner, maybe just resting after a long day? Drop it in the comments. Please keep in mind that some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. It was a mindless task, something to keep my hands occupied, to stop my mind from drifting back to the empty chair in the living room. The granite counter was cold beneath my fingers. Evelyn had chosen that granite. She had loved this kitchen, and now someone who never showed her a moment of genuine respect was standing on her floor, reaching for the rewards of a lifetime's worth of her labor. That was when I heard the sharp, rapid click of expensive heels striking the hardwood. I shut off the faucet and dried my hands. Serena strutted into the kitchen. There was not a single tear in her eyes. There was not a shadow of sorrow anywhere on her perfectly made-up face. She was dressed in a crisp black designer suit, looking far more like someone headed to a hostile corporate takeover than a woman mourning the death of her mother-in-law. Without a word of comfort, without even the courtesy of asking how I was holding together after the worst week of my life, she dropped a thick navy blue folder onto the counter. The sound was loud and deliberate. I looked down at it. Printed across the top page in bold black letters were the words "Emergency Handover and Succession Agreement." My eyes moved from the document back up to Serena. "What is this, Serena?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. She let out an exaggerated, theatrical sigh, as though she were dealing with a stubborn child who simply refused to see reason. It is for your own good, Gerald, she said smoothly, leaning against the counter. You are 70 years old. You just lost Evelyn. You are grieving, and you are in no condition to be running Hartley Logistics right now. You need to sign this agreement today so we can transfer executive authority over to Bryce. Bryce was my 18-year-old grandson, a boy who had barely scraped through high school and spent considerably more time photographing his sports cars for social media than he ever had studying a financial balance sheet. I stared down at the legal document and felt a cold, hard knot take shape deep in my gut. Hartley Logistics was not merely a company to me. It was the blood, the sweat, and the sacrifice of my entire adult life. Evelyn and I had built that $15 million empire from a single battered freight van back in 1983. We had no wealthy investors behind us. We had exactly $200 in our bank account, and a dream we refused to let go of. We burned through our 20s, eating cold sandwiches in freezing parking lots, sleeping in the cramped cab of that van, and fighting for every single client we ever landed. Evelyn managed the books on a fold-out table while I pushed through blizzards to make deliveries on time. And now, only 3 days after I had laid to rest, the woman who built all of this beside me, my daughter-in-law, was standing in her kitchen, demanding I hand the keys to a teenager so she could work the puppet strings from the shadows. I did not raise my voice. I did not let her see my anger. In business, the first one to lose their composure is the first one to lose the deal. I simply looked at her and said, "The company is running just fine. I am grieving Serena. I am not incapacitated." Right on cue, my son Colin walked into the kitchen. He was 42 years old, but standing in the shadow of his overbearing wife, he had the bearing of a frightened boy waiting to be told what to do. He stepped forward and rested a hand gently on my shoulder, wearing a carefully rehearsed mask of deep fatherly concern. He had on a custom suit I had paid for, living a comfortable life I had entirely funded. And yet, here he was working to put me out to pasture before the soil on his mother's grave had even settled. "Dad, please just hear her out," Colin said softly, his voice carrying a slight tremble. "The doctor said your blood pressure has been dangerously high since Mom got sick. We are worried sick about you. We cannot bear the thought of losing you too. Just sign the papers, let Bryce hold the title inside the family trust, and Serena and I will manage the day-to-day operations. You can finally step back and look after yourself. You will not have to carry a single worry anymore." It sounded remarkably caring. It was the perfect, plausible lie a devoted son and a dutiful daughter-in-law stepping in to lift an impossible burden from a grieving old man's shoulders. But I knew Colin better than any person alive. I had spent millions on his elite Ivy League education and watched him grow into a man who could not make a single significant decision without his wife's explicit approval. I glanced at the heavy silver pen Serena had conveniently placed right beside the folder. "I will think about it," I said quietly, pushing back slightly from the counter. "I need time to read through the legal clauses before I put my name on anything." Colin nodded quickly, visibly relieved I had not refused outright. "Of course, Dad, take whatever time you need," he said, manufacturing a warm smile. "Just do not wait too long. The market is volatile right now, and the company needs steady hands at the wheel." They turned and walked out of the kitchen together, their footsteps fading down the long hallway until the house fell silent again. I stood motionless at the counter, my heart knocking a slow, heavy beat inside my chest. I turned my head toward the large bay window that faced out into the corridor. The glass had gone dark against the evening sky, turning itself into a perfect mirror. In that reflection, I caught Serena pausing near the front door. She slipped her phone from her designer purse, and her fingers began moving rapidly across the screen. She had no idea whatsoever that her reflection was visible to me from where I stood. I watched carefully as she typed. I did not need to guess at her message because as she hit send, she let the words spill out in a low, triumphant murmur, a vicious smirk, pulling at the corner of her mouth. The old man took the bait, she whispered to herself, tucking the phone away. Prep the chairs. I stood alone in that quiet, empty kitchen, warm water still dripping slowly from the faucet. They genuinely believed I was a broken, clueless old widower who would simply roll over and surrender everything. They thought they had outmaneuvered me inside my own home, but they were about to receive a very costly education. A lone wolf might lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth. And I was about to bite back hard. The following morning, I was awake long before the sun had any intention of rising. Sleep had barely come. The silence of the house without Evelyn was suffocating, and the weight of knowing my own family was conspiring against me made the air feel thinner still. I needed the familiar hum of my empire to clear my head. I needed to walk the halls of Hartley Logistics and remind myself of exactly who I was before my greedy children had reduced me in their minds to a helpless old widower. By 600 in the morning, I was rolling into the executive parking lot. The crisp morning air cut sharp against my face as I crossed toward the towering glass building. This place was my sanctuary. Every ounce of my energy lived inside these walls. I crossed through the quiet lobby, exchanged a nod with the night security guard, and rode the private elevator straight to the executive floor. I passed my own office without stopping and walked directly to the executive archives at the far end of the corridor. Those archives held backup records of every major financial transaction and trust document tied to Hartley Logistics. If Serena and Colin were engineering a hostile takeover, the foundational operating agreements would be their first target. I reached the heavy security door and pulled my master keycard from my pocket. I pressed the card against the electronic reader, expecting the familiar green light and the satisfying click of the lock releasing. Instead, the keypad issued a harsh, flat tone. The small indicator blinked a hard, angry red. Access denied. I stared at the panel. My card was the master key. It was programmed never to expire and to open every room in the building without exception. I swiped it a second time. The reader beeped again. Red. Access denied. I pressed the card against the sensor a third time, firm and deliberate. Red light. Access completely denied. Are you having some trouble with the door, Gerald? The voice rose out of the shadows near the break room, startlingly loud in the stillness of the hallway. I turned around slowly. Stepping into the dim morning light was Clifford Drummond. Clifford was our chief financial officer, 45 years old, always in custom-tailored suits, and tonight wearing far too much expensive cologne. The thick scent of musk and cedar came off him in waves that turned my stomach. He approached me with a practiced plastic smile fixed firmly in place. He looked altogether too alert and too comfortable for 600 in the morning. Clifford, I said, holding my voice perfectly calm. My master keycard appears to be malfunctioning. It is refusing my clearance for the executive archives. Clifford stopped a few feet away from me, tucking his manicured hands into his pockets. Oh, right, he said, his smile stretching just a fraction wider. I should have flagged this for you. We are running a major system update on the security servers this weekend. Colin authorized a full overhaul of the digital access protocols to keep our corporate data locked down. The system is temporarily restricting entry to all sensitive areas while the technicians handle the file migration. Colin authorized it. I repeated the words slowly, letting them settle into the empty corridor. Clifford gave a smooth nod, entirely unfazed. Yes. Colin decided it was the right moment to push the security migration through. He mentioned you would be taking an extended leave to grieve Evelyn, so he moved forward and approved the technology overhaul on his own initiative. Do not trouble yourself over any of it, Gerald. Everything is completely in hand. Go home and rest. I looked into Clifford Drummond's eyes. They were cold, calculating, and swimming with quiet contempt. He knew precisely what was happening, and he knew that I knew it too. They were locking me out of my own company, erecting a digital fortress to conceal whatever financial crimes were already being committed inside these walls. My son's name was the face they had placed on the entire operation. The old Gerald would have seized Clifford by his silk tie and hurled him through the glass doors. I would have ordered the security team to break that archive lock on the spot. But the man standing in that corridor now was a seasoned veteran of corporate warfare. If I made a scene, I would tip my hand. I would give them the argument that grief had made me act irrationally. I would hand Serena exactly the ammunition she needed to declare me mentally unfit to lead. I am not going to quarrel with you, Clifford, I said smoothly, managing a courteous nod. A security update is probably long overdue. Pass along to Colin that I appreciate his sudden enthusiasm for data protection. I turned my back on the chief financial officer and walked without haste toward my private office. I could feel his arrogant gaze drilling into me from behind, but I did not look back. I stepped inside and turned the lock on the heavy oak door. I settled into my leather chair. They believed cutting off my keycard would leave me blind. They thought controlling the modern servers meant controlling the flow of information, but they had fundamentally misread the way an old wolf defends his territory. I reached down and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pressed my thumb against a biometric scanner concealed beneath the wooden panel. A soft click broke the quiet of the room. A hidden compartment slid open. Nestled inside was a thick, dust-covered external hard drive. I had no need for their network access. 10 years ago, anticipating exactly this kind of corporate betrayal, I had a back door coded directly into the mainframe. That drive held an offline mirror of every digital skeleton buried inside Hartley Logistics. I connected it to my secure laptop. The screen blinked to life, prompting me through a sequence of encrypted passwords only I possessed. My fingers hovered above the keys. I was seconds away from cutting through their flimsy firewall and pulling whatever rot Serena and Clifford had been hiding in my financial records out into the open. I drew a slow breath, ready to throw the first punch in this silent war. Before my finger could find the enter key, my private cell phone erupted and shattered the stillness. I flinched, pulling my hand back from the keyboard. Very few people had that number. No one should have been dialing it at 6:30 in the morning. I drew the phone from my jacket pocket and studied the glowing screen. The caller ID showed the name of the local county hospital. A cold wave of dread moved through me. Hospitals do not ring at dawn to deliver good news. I answered and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Gerald Hartley," a woman asked. Her tone was brisk and professional, but it carried an unmistakable undercurrent of urgency. "This is the emergency department at Covenant Medical Center. I am calling regarding your grandson, Bryce Hartley. He has been in a severe motorcycle accident. He is in the trauma unit, and we need family members here right away." I slammed the laptop shut and drove the encrypted hard drive back into the hidden compartment of my oak desk. The digital war for Hartley Logistics would have to wait. My grandson was bleeding. I snatched my car keys with trembling hands, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I sprinted out of my private office, barely registering the confused and irritated expression on Clifford Drummond's face as I blew past the corporate break room. I struck the elevator button with my palm, my mind flooding with harrowing images of Bryce lying broken on cold asphalt. He was a reckless teenager with far too much money and far too little sense, but he was still my family. He was the only heir Evelyn had truly doted on through her final years. The drive to Covenant Medical Center was a terrifying blur of traffic lights, blaring horns, and desperate lane changes through the morning rush. I broke every speed limit in the city, gripping the cold leather steering wheel until my knuckles went white and my forearms ached with tension. I pushed the accelerator all the way to the floor, praying silently that I would not arrive too late. I left my car in the emergency drop-off zone without a thought about the violation and burst through the sliding glass doors of the hospital. The harsh, fluorescent glare of the trauma ward stung my tired eyes. The thick smell of antiseptic and stale waiting room coffee hung in the chilly morning air. I spotted them immediately at the far end of the long, sterile hallway. Serena was pacing back and forth, her expensive designer heels striking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the polished linoleum floor. She was hammering furiously at her smartphone, looking far more inconvenienced than devastated. Colin sat slumped in an uncomfortable plastic waiting room chair, with his head buried deep in his hands. His tailored suit was badly wrinkled, and his broad shoulders trembled slightly beneath the bright hospital lights. I moved quickly down the hallway, my heavy footsteps announcing my arrival. Colin looked up, his face ashen and slicked with a cold sweat. "Dad," he choked out, rising quick and dragging his hands across his trousers. "I got here as fast as I possibly could," I said, gripping his shaking shoulders. What happened out there, and how bad is he?" Colin swallowed hard, his eyes darting anxiously toward Serena, who had finally lowered her phone and was regarding me with mild annoyance. "He took a corner way too fast on that brand new sports motorcycle," Colin said, his voice trembling. "He lost control and slid straight into a steel guardrail on the highway. He had his helmet on, thank God, no severe brain damage or spinal trauma, but he suffered a deep laceration to his left thigh and some internal bruising around his ribs. He had already lost a significant amount of blood at the scene before the paramedics arrived and got a tourniquet in place." Serena snapped her arms across her chest and let out a sharp, exasperated sigh that rang through the quiet corridor. "It is a complete and utter disaster, Gerald. We were scheduled to finalize the executive trust transfer this afternoon, and now we are trapped in this wretched waiting room." I stared at her, stunned by her total absence of maternal concern. Her teenage son was on a surgical table, and all she could mourn was a disrupted calendar. Before I could say a word about her breathtaking callousness, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open. A visibly exhausted attending physician stepped out into the waiting area. He wore blue surgical scrubs marked with small, dark stains of fresh blood. His mask was pulled down around his neck, revealing a deeply lined and thoroughly drained face. "Family of Bryce Hartley," he called out, his voice carrying down the hospital corridor. We moved forward together, forming a tight, anxious cluster around the weary doctor. "He is stable for the moment," the physician said, raising a thick metal clipboard and clicking his pen. "We have successfully controlled the primary hemorrhaging in his upper leg, and his vital signs are holding steady on the monitors. However, his hemoglobin levels are dropping to a critically low point. We need to administer a large blood transfusion immediately to prevent him from slipping into severe hypovolemic shock." Colin let out a loud, shuddering breath of profound relief, leaning heavily against the painted drywall for support. "Then do it immediately," Serena demanded, waving her manicured hand at the doctor. "Give him the blood he needs and patch him up so we can get out of this depressing place. We have a private recovery suite waiting for him at home." The doctor frowned deeply, visibly unimpressed by Serena and her imperious attitude. "Nah, it is not that simple, ma'am," he said, his professional tone growing firm. "Your son has a very rare and specific blood type. He is AB positive. Under ordinary circumstances, this would not be a major logistical problem. but our hospital blood bank suffered an unprecedented shortage this week due to a multi-car pileup on the interstate. We do not have sufficient AB positive or universal donor blood in our current inventory to safely complete the required transfusion. He looked directly at Colin, then shifted his steady gaze to Serena. We need direct family donors right now. The boy needs blood flowing into his veins within the next hour to survive. We can bring you both to the lab and cross-match you immediately to save his life. The world around me seemed to stop entirely. The low mechanical hum of the hospital ventilation faded away. The distant beeping of cardiac monitors went silent in my ringing ears. The doctor's words echoed through my mind, repeating over and over like a skipping record. AB positive. The boy is AB positive. My mind sharpened over decades of analyzing complex corporate data and catching factual inconsistencies, locked immediately onto a biological impossibility that could not be explained away. I am an O blood type. My beloved late wife, Evelyn, was an O blood type. By the immovable laws of human genetics, 2 O blood type parents can only ever produce O blood type children. My biological son, Colin, was without any shadow of doubt an O blood type. I knew this for a fact. I could clearly remember the medical paperwork from his childhood appendectomy. Serena, I recalled from a passing conversation during a minor family health scare years back, was an A blood type. I stood motionless in the sterile hospital corridor, my eyes fixed on the white wall behind the doctor. Basic biology began screaming alarms inside my head. An O-type parent and an A-type parent can produce an A or an O-type child. What they cannot produce under any conceivable scientific circumstance is an AB-positive child. The B allele had to originate somewhere. It had to come from a biological father who actively carried that genetic trait. Colin did not carry it. I did not carry it. Evelyn did not carry it. There was only one impossible, devastating conclusion standing directly in front of me in that bright, sterile hallway. The teenager bleeding on the operating table, the boy I had spoiled and loved and carefully prepared to inherit my $15 million logistics empire, did not carry a single drop of Hartley blood in his veins. Bryce was not my biological grandson. I turned my head slowly toward Serena. She was deep in a heated argument with the tired doctor, loudly insisting he contact another facility to fly in the necessary blood by emergency helicopter. She was putting on a forceful, aggressive performance, a deliberate effort to draw attention away from the obvious request that she donate her own blood. She knew she could not comply without the truth coming out. Then I shifted my cold gaze to my son. I fully expected to see a man baffled by the genetics, a worried father demanding to know if the lab had made a catastrophic error. Instead, what I saw chilled me straight through and broke something deep inside my chest. Colin was pressed hard against the hospital wall, gripping the metal handrail with white knuckles. He was not looking at the doctor. He was not looking at his furious wife. He was staring down at the linoleum floor, his entire body trembling beneath his expensive suit. Sweat was rolling in heavy beads down his pale forehead. He was not confused by the science. He was terrified of it. He knew. He absolutely, undeniably knew the genetic arithmetic did not balance. When he finally gathered the nerve to lift his head, he found my eyes already fixed on him. For one brief, harrowing second, our gazes met across the corridor. He saw the cold, hard recognition settling across my face. He saw that I had done the math and reached the only possible answer. Colin immediately looked away, unable to hold his father's eyes, the father he was actively conspiring to destroy. The heavy silence in the corridor was eventually broken when Serena produced her platinum credit card. She thrust it at the attending physician, demanding he contact a neighboring private facility and arrange an emergency helicopter transport for the blood supply, regardless of the cost. The doctor, recognizing he was dealing with people who believed money could bend any reality, gave a curt nod and disappeared back through the trauma bay doors to make the necessary calls. With the immediate medical emergency temporarily managed by Serena's aggressive financial intervention, a suffocating tension settled over the three of us. We were no longer simply a family waiting on a medical update. We were a family balanced on a mountain of carefully constructed lies. And that mountain had just cracked straight through its foundation. I did not press the matter there in the open hallway. Confronting a cornered animal in a public space is a tactical mistake I had learned to avoid long ago in brutal corporate negotiations. Instead, I let the silence sit and stretch for a few more agonizing minutes. I looked at Colin, who was still refusing to meet my eyes, and calmly suggested we fetch coffee from the hospital cafeteria downstairs while we waited for the helicopter transport. He hesitated, his eyes darting instinctively toward Serena for silent permission. Serena, already absorbed by another incoming message on her smartphone, waved him off dismissively. She clearly wanted the room to conduct her own private business, away from my watchful presence. Colin swallowed hard, nodded weakly, and followed me toward the elevators. The hospital cafeteria was a bleak, cheerless cavern tucked into the basement of the building. Harsh, fluorescent lights flickered above their pale yellow glow, reflecting off the linoleum floor and washing over scattered plastic tables. The air carried the heavy odor of burned coffee and industrial bleach. We collected 2 cups of bitter, lukewarm coffee in thin styrofoam cups and settled at a secluded table in the far back corner of the empty room. Colin sat across from me, gripping his cup with both hands, as though the flimsy styrofoam was the only thing anchoring him to the physical world. His shoulders were hunched forward, his expensive suit jacket hanging slack off his defeated frame. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the awful coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. I set the cup down and met his eyes across the small table. "So," I said, my voice calm, measured, entirely free of accusation. That was quite a tense moment up there with the doctor. I suppose it is fortunate Serena was willing to cover the cost of the transport. But I have to admit, Colin, the medical details left me a little puzzled. The doctor was quite clear that Bryce is AB positive. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the sticky plastic table. Evelyn and I were both O blood types. You are an O blood type. Serena is an A. How does a boy with those parents end up AB positive? Colin flinched, as if I had reached across the table and struck him. The sweat that had barely dried on his forehead returned instantly in glistening beads. He squeezed the styrofoam cup so hard the hot coffee nearly crested the rim. He did not look puzzled. He did not offer any natural confusion about a possible lab error. Instead, he exploded with immediate, desperate hostility. He slammed the cup down, his voice cracking with a shrill, panicked anger. "You are grieving and not thinking straight, Dad." He snapped, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson. The lab made a simple typographical error on his chart. It happens all the time in these chaotic emergency rooms. Do not start your paranoid interrogations today. My son is lying in a hospital bed, and you are trying to turn a simple clerical mistake into some kind of ridiculous conspiracy. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full force of his outburst. In the ruthless world of logistics and corporate acquisitions, I had faced hundreds of desperate men across a table, all of them trying to conceal terrible truths. I knew precisely what genuine confusion looked like. I knew exactly what righteous indignation looked like. And I knew without any doubt what a cornered, guilty coward looked like when the walls of his own deception began pressing in on him. Colin was not a stupid man, but he was a devastatingly poor liar. He was concealing something enormous, and his explosive, uncharacteristic aggression only served to confirm my absolute worst fear. A man who truly believed it was a simple lab typo would have brushed my question aside with a tired sigh. He would have gently reminded me that clerical errors are common. But he came at me. He weaponized my fresh grief over Evelyn to deflect a perfectly logical biological question. As I studied the sweating defensive figure sitting across from me, a profound and heavy sadness moved through my soul. This was my son. This was the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for. While Evelyn and I were eating cold sandwiches in the cramped cab of our very first delivery van, grinding to build Hartley Logistics from nothing we were dreaming of, the future we could hand this boy. We poured millions into his privileged upbringing, exclusive private schools, lavish summer vacations, a prestigious Ivy League education. We gave him every advantage we ourselves had never had, hoping to forge a strong, capable leader who could carry our empire into the next generation. But all that money and privilege and costly education had only managed to produce a remarkably weak-willed follower. Colin had come back from his elite university not as a conqueror, but as a man with no internal compass of his own. He was someone who preferred the comfortable path of least resistance, who consistently deferred to the loudest, most forceful voice in the room. And the loudest, most forceful voice he had ever encountered in his life was his manipulative, socially ambitious wife, Serena. She had recognized quickly just how pliable he was, and she had spent the better part of 2 decades carefully shaping him into a compliant, silent instrument of her own grand and greedy ambitions. He was not a partner in his marriage. He was a hostage who had gradually fallen in love with his captor. I let the silence hang between us, holding his gaze without blinking, refusing to release him from its weight. "You are probably right, Colin," I finally said, my voice dropping to a soft, deliberate whisper. "It must simply be a typographical error. After all, what other explanation could there possibly be?" My words were chosen with surgical care, each one carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of threat. Colin swallowed visibly, his throat working hard against his collar. He dropped his eyes, entirely unable to hold the steady, knowing pressure of my gaze. He muttered a weak, barely coherent agreement, staring at the dark liquid turning slowly in his cup. He knew that I knew, and he knew he was powerless to stop the storm building on the horizon. I rose slowly from the flimsy plastic chair, leaving my untouched coffee sitting on the table. "Take a moment to collect yourself, son," I said, fastening my suit jacket with calm, measured movements. "I am going to head back upstairs and check on the transport's arrival." I walked away without waiting for a response, leaving him alone in that depressing, fluorescent basement to sit with the full, crushing weight of his guilt. I rode the slow elevator back up to the trauma floor, my mind already working through 1,000 complex scenarios, calculating variables, mapping legal and financial countermeasures. When the doors parted on the surgical level, I stepped out into the quiet corridor. I did not head straight back to the waiting area. Instead, I stopped behind the thick concrete pillar near the nurses' station, keeping myself entirely hidden in the shadows. Further down the long, sterile hallway, positioned near the wide glass windows overlooking the city streets below, was Serena. She was whispering furiously into her phone, pacing in tight, agitated circles. It was absolutely not a laboratory typographical error. Bryce was definitely not a biological Hartley. I needed undeniable proof, and I already knew exactly how I would get it. The emergency helicopter arrived shortly after Serena's frantic calls. The transfusion was a complete success. Bryce stabilized quickly, and within a few hours the attending physician declared him out of danger. By late afternoon he was discharged with crutches, pain medication, and firm orders to rest. I played the relieved grandfather to absolute perfection. I embraced Colin, offered Serena a warm smile, and told them I would check in on them later. Then I went home and prepared for an entirely different kind of operation. I needed proof that would hold up, and I needed it secured before they realized I had seen through their deception. I bought 2 large containers of beef stew, transferring the contents into my own glass containers to pass them off as a homemade gesture. I tucked a pair of latex gloves and 3 sterile plastic bags into the pocket of my wool overcoat. The sun had already gone down by the time I pulled into their driveway. It was a grand estate with manicured lawns and a stone facade paid for entirely with my money. I had written the down payment check 3 years ago, wanting to secure a stable home for the boy I had mistakenly believed was my own flesh and blood. Standing at the edge of that driveway, now staring up at the glowing windows, I felt a deep and sickening sense of violation. I climbed the stone steps and pressed the heavy brass doorbell. Colin opened the door looking hollowed out and still wearing the creased suit from the hospital. "Dad," he said, his voice threaded with surprise and a sharp edge of unease. "You really did not need to come all the way out here tonight. You should be home resting." I raised the glass containers with a gentle smile. "I could not sleep, son," I said quietly. "I know you are both exhausted. I brought warm soup so neither of you has to think about cooking." Colin stepped aside and let me into the grand foyer. The house was hushed thick carpeting swallowing the sound of my footsteps. We moved through to the kitchen. Serena was perched at the marble island, a glass of red wine in one hand and a stack of hospital discharge papers in the other. She did not stand. She did not greet me. Instead, she launched immediately into a loud complaint about the staggering cost of the emergency medical transport she had personally demanded only hours before. "Can you believe what these private transport companies charge?" she scoffed, flinging a bill onto the counter. "They are billing us a premium for a 20-minute helicopter ride. It is highway robbery." I set the soup on the counter, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "Health and safety have no price tag, Serena," I replied evenly. "We are fortunate that Bryce is resting comfortably upstairs." She rolled her eyes and reached for her wine, missing entirely the double meaning folded inside my words. Colin offered to heat the soup and moved toward the stove. I seized the opening. "I am going to wash my hands and look in on the boy for a moment," I said casually, turning away from the kitchen before either of them could raise an objection. I moved up the staircase, my heart ticking with a cold and precise rhythm. The second floor was dim and silent. I passed the master bedroom and walked straight to the end of the hallway where Bryce kept his private suite. I eased his bedroom door open by no more than a fraction. He was deep asleep in his large bed, his injured leg propped on a stack of soft pillows, a pair of noise-canceling headphones covering his ears. I drew the door quietly shut and slipped directly into his attached bathroom. The room carried the scent of expensive cologne and mint toothpaste. I reached into my overcoat pocket and produced the sterile plastic bags and the latex gloves. I snapped the gloves over my hands with the quiet efficiency of a man entirely locked onto his objective. I swung open the mirrored medicine cabinet above the porcelain sink. There, in a sleek ceramic holder, sat his green electric toothbrush. The bristles were still faintly damp from recent use, a perfect uncontaminated source of raw genetic material. I extracted the toothbrush with care, keeping my fingers well clear of the bristlehead, and lowered it into the first sterile plastic bag. I sealed the zipper, secured the evidence deep in my pocket, and eased the medicine cabinet shut without producing a single sound. That was half the battle won. Now I needed Colin. I stripped off the latex gloves and slipped back out of the bathroom, moving silently down the carpeted hallway. Rather than heading straight back to the kitchen, I made a sharp detour toward the laundry room and mudroom tucked just off the garage. Colin was nothing if not a creature of habit. 3 times a week he dragged himself to some executive gym And every single time he'd dump his reeking workout clothes into a canvas laundry bin by the garage door, far too lazy to walk the extra steps to the washing machine. I slipped into the darkened mudroom aisles, moving across the shelves and hooks. The canvas laundry bin was right where I expected it. Sitting on top of the pile was his navy athletic hoodie, exactly where he'd carelessly thrown it the afternoon before the medical emergency had upended everyone's week. I pulled on a fresh pair of surgical gloves and lifted the dark fabric toward the thin security light bleeding in through the garage window. I combed every inch of the collar and inner lining with sharp concentration. 30 seconds was all it took. Woven into the damp fabric near the neckline were two distinct dark brown hairs. I drew a pair of small metal tweezers from my pocket, pinched the very tips of those hairs, and eased them free from the lining. Held up to the light, I could confirm the tiny whitish root follicles were perfectly intact at the base. More than enough biological material for a definitive match. I dropped both hairs into the second sterile plastic bag, sealed it, and nestled it beside the toothbrush already waiting in my coat pocket. Gloves off, overcoat smoothed. I strolled back into the sprawling kitchen as though nothing in the world had changed. Colin was ladling warm soup into porcelain bowls. I smiled, played the weary, deeply relieved grandfather for another 10 minutes, then gracefully took my leave, claiming the long, emotional day had finally claimed my aging body. They watched me walk out the front door without the slightest idea that I was carrying the complete obliteration of their carefully constructed world in my coat pocket. I got into my car, locked the doors, and pulled out of their pristine suburban neighborhood. But I didn't point the car toward home. I swung onto the dark interstate and pressed the accelerator down hard. I drove straight through the night to a private genetics laboratory 2 towns over. I'd called ahead during the drive using a premium emergency line to arrange a strictly confidential after-hours appointment. I arrived at the sleek, unmarked medical building just past 2 in the morning. A stern laboratory technician in a white coat met me at the heavy glass security doors and let me through. I handed over the 2 sealed plastic bags and a thick envelope holding exactly $5,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. I told him I needed an expedited priority analysis today. The young technician counted every bill with care, labeled both bags with random numerical barcodes to guarantee anonymity, and assured me of definitive, legally binding results within 48 hours. By the time I walked back out of that clinic, the eastern sky was already bleeding faint streaks of purple dawn. The morning chill cut at my face, but deep in my chest burned a strange and steady heat. The biological evidence was secured. The scientific hammer was in motion. I unlocked my car and settled into the cold leather seat, releasing a slow, heavy breath. I reached into my pocket for my keys, and my fingers found my phone instead. The screen blazed to life, vibrating hard against my palm. An automated security alert. Triggered by the hidden digital backdoor I had coded into the Hartley logistics server 10 years ago. I read the glowing text and felt the blood turn to ice in my veins. Someone inside the company was trying to push through a massive unauthorized wire transfer, $4.5 million, and was desperately attempting to use my personal digital signature to do it. I threw the car into gear and tore out of the parking lot. The sun was climbing now, streaking the morning sky in vivid orange and gold, but my world had never felt darker or colder. My mind ran faster than the engine beneath me. Whoever, while sitting at a terminal inside Hartley Logistics forcing that wire transfer through, was growing desperate. They were trying to circumvent the primary authentication protocols using a forged version of my digital footprint. I didn't head for the corporate offices. Confronting Clifford, or whoever was at that desk, would only hand them the chance to wipe the servers and bury the digital evidence before I could lock it down. I drove straight home instead, to the large, empty house that felt more like a mausoleum than any kind of refuge. I bypassed the kitchen and moved down the long hallway to my private home office. I locked the door behind me, pulled the thick wooden blinds shut, and let the shadows swallow the room. Then I switched on the desk lamp and sat down at my secure home terminal. 10 years ago, as Hartley Logistics was expanding rapidly, and we were fighting off aggressive corporate espionage from rival firms, I had brought in a brilliant independent programmer to engineer a failsafe into our network architecture. A digital ghost, a completely invisible backdoor buried directly into the foundational framework of the company servers. I never told Evelyn about it. I certainly never breathed a word to Colin or the board of directors. It was my ultimate insurance policy built precisely for a catastrophic moment like this one. I booted the terminal and typed a complex sequence of commands that hadn't been touched in a decade. The screen went black. Then it erupted in cascading lines of green code. I was in. I moved through the invisible channels of the network, slipping past the heavily publicized corporate firewalls without triggering a single alarm. I located the active terminal behind the security alert. It was registered to the executive financial suite. Clifford Drummond was already at work. Awake early, hammering away at a heavily encrypted wire transfer using a spoofed credential package built to impersonate my authorization. I watched his keystrokes in real time like a ghost watching a burglar fumble with a lock. Clifford was a smooth, calculating accountant, but his grasp of deep network architecture was arrogant and fatally flawed. He had constructed internal lockouts to blind the general accounting staff and block my standard administrative access. But those walls were built on the surface. He had no idea I was moving beneath the floor of his digital fortress. With a handful of precise keystrokes, I isolated his transfer request and quietly quarantined the transaction, suspending the $4.5 million in a hidden digital purgatory, where he could neither complete the transfer nor erase the footprint of his attempt. He was perfectly trapped. My heart hammered with equal parts fury and cold focus as I prepared to go deeper. I needed to know how long this disease had been eating through my company, and I needed every piece of undeniable evidence secured before anyone realized the net had closed. With the immediate financial bleeding stopped, I turned to the source of the rot. I needed to see exactly how far the infection had spread. I traced the destination of the blocked wire transfer following the routing numbers through a dizzying maze of offshore protocols and disguised corporate shells. What I found was a sophisticated, meticulously engineered labyrinth of financial fraud. Clifford hadn't merely been skimming off the top. He had constructed a massive systemic pipeline designed to drain the lifeblood of my company dry. 4 distinct shell companies, all recently registered in the state of Delaware under fabricated limited liability corporations. They carried generic, forgettable names that dissolved effortlessly into a standard corporate expense report: Global Freight Solutions, Apex Logistics Consulting, Horizon Management Partners, and Zenith Supply Chain Associates. I pulled up the accounting ledgers tied to these phantom entities. The digital paper trail laid out a relentless barrage of fabricated invoices, phantom consulting services, non-existent software upgrades, dummy logistical routes that Hartley Logistics had supposedly subcontracted. The sheer volume of false invoices was staggering, yet each one had been carefully sized to slide just beneath the threshold that would trigger an automatic secondary board review. Clifford had orchestrated each payment to resemble a standard operational expense, disguising the theft behind an impenetrable wall of tedious corporate paperwork. I began pulling down every ledger, every fraudulent invoice, every routing number onto my secure hard drive, building a permanent, unalterable record of their criminal enterprise. The depth of the deception was sickening. It revealed a level of calculated greed that shattered every last illusion I had ever held about the people running operations inside my own corporate headquarters. I pushed further, matching the dates on the fraudulent invoices against the corresponding outflows of corporate capital. I pulled up the company's master ledger and cross-referenced the missing money against our internal accounts. When the figures finally lined up on the glowing screen, a wave of profound nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the desk edge just to hold myself steady. The money wasn't being drawn from our operational revenue. It wasn't coming from our expansion reserves. The $4.5 million that Clifford and Serena had bled away over the past 8 months was being systematically drained from one specific source, the employee pension fund. They were looting the hard-earned retirement savings of the truck drivers, warehouse managers, and logistics coordinators who had given their working lives to build this company beside me. But the worst part, the part that cut deepest, was the timeline. I stared at the dates on those largest outgoing wire transfers, a sharp, twisting agony spreading through my chest. The first massive withdrawal had been initiated 8 months ago. That was the exact same week Evelyn received her terminal cancer diagnosis. While I sat in sterile oncology waiting rooms clutching my dying wife's fragile hand and weeping over her hospital bed, my daughter-in-law and my chief financial officer were busy emptying the company vaults. They knew I was consumed by grief and medical decisions. They knew every ounce of my attention was fixed on the woman I loved more than anything in this world. They weaponized my pain and used Evelyn's tragic decline as a prolonged, convenient distraction to orchestrate their massive theft. Every time Serena visited the hospice facility, she was calculating how much more she could take. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the monitor's glow casting pale light across the darkened room. The pieces of this puzzle were snapping into place with terrifying clarity. The massive embezzlement of the pension fund, the phantom Delaware corporations, the frantic pre-dawn attempt to force a final wire transfer through the system, and the sudden aggressive push for me to sign the succession documents mere days after Evelyn's funeral. I reached into my briefcase and drew out the thick navy blue folder Serena had slammed onto my kitchen counter the day before the emergency handover and succession agreement. I flipped past the opening pages of legal language covering executive powers and skipped directly to the final clauses buried deep at the document's end. There it was, concealed beneath layers of dense corporate terminology, a comprehensive indemnification clause, fully absolving the incoming executive board of any prior financial discrepancies, and a mandatory authorization for the upcoming end-of-year audit requiring my signature as the sole approving authority. The handover document was never about seizing power. It was never about Serena ruling the company from behind a curtain. The document was a meticulously crafted legal shield. The end-of-year corporate audit was set to begin in less than 3 weeks. An independent auditing firm would tear through the company ledgers and take less than an hour to notice a $4.5 million crater in the employee pension fund. When federal investigators inevitably arrived to pick through the wreckage, they would demand answers. They would pull up the digital authorization logs. They would find the spoofed credentials bearing my digital signature. And if I had signed that handover document, I would have been legally authenticating every financial operation conducted prior to the transfer of power. Serena and Clifford weren't just stealing from me. They were methodically framing me for the entire scheme. They intended to use my own signature to bury the embezzlement entirely under my name. They needed that signature to seal my coffin, and they had been willing to exploit my grief to obtain it. They had vastly underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. The hours after my discovery in the digital shadows of Hartley Logistics crawled by with suffocating weight. I had paralyzed Clifford Drummond's frantic attempt to move that $4.5 million, locking the stolen pension funds in a frozen void. But that was only the financial front. The biological war was still being fought in silence, waiting for science to deliver its undeniable verdict. I stayed sealed inside my dimly lit home office for 2 days. I ignored the relentless phone calls from my son Colin, who was growing increasingly anxious about my silence on the succession agreement. I ignored the demanding text messages from Serena, puzzled as to why her perfectly constructed trap had not yet snapped shut. I had to maintain absolute silence. Moving now without every last piece of the puzzle locked firmly into place would be a catastrophic tactical error. I drank bitter black coffee and stared at the walls, my mind breaking the betrayal down into manageable, actionable parts. Then, on the morning of the third day, the secure burner phone on my desk vibrated sharply. A local number, the private genetics laboratory I had visited under cover of darkness. I picked up immediately, my voice level and drained of any emotion. "Mr. Hartley," a sterile professional voice came through the speaker. "We have completed the expedited analysis on the biological samples you provided. The full results have been compiled, verified, and sealed. They are ready for immediate physical pickup at our front desk." I did not ask for the results over the phone. I needed to hold the physical document in my hands. I thanked the technician, ended the call, and reached for my heavy wool overcoat. The final nail in the coffin of my family was waiting for me. The drive to the private clinic felt entirely different in the stark clarity of the morning sun. When I had traveled this same route 3 nights ago, I was a man driven by desperate, frantic suspicion, moving through ordinary suburban streets, watching ordinary people live their ordinary lives. Now I was a man marching toward an inevitable reckoning. I pulled into the sleek, unmarked lot of the medical building and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The clinical white walls of the lobby offered nothing in the way of comfort. I approached the reception desk and provided the anonymous numerical barcodes the technician had assigned to my samples. The receptionist, a young woman who looked far too bright-eyed for a place that routinely delivered life-altering news, checked her terminal and retrieved a thick, tamper-proof envelope from a locked filing cabinet. She slid it across the counter, entirely unaware of the devastation sealed within its walls. I took the envelope, feeling its weight in my hands. I did not open it in the lobby. I needed complete privacy. I walked back out through the sliding glass doors, their automated hum sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I climbed into the driver's seat, pulled the heavy door shut, and locked it. I started the engine and let the deep, steady rumble fill the cabin. The heater pushed warm air across my cold hands, but it did nothing at all, to melt the ice that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. I sat there in the idling car for a long time, eyes fixed on the blank face of the envelope resting on the passenger seat. Inside that paper casing was the absolute scientific truth about my bloodline. I had spent 18 years looking at Bryce, searching his adolescent features for traces of my own face, hunting for Evelyn's bright smile in his expressions, looking for my own relentless drive in his choices. Now I was about to find out whether I had been searching for ghosts all along. I drew a slow, steadying breath, reached over and picked up the envelope. I slid one finger beneath the sealed flap and tore it open in a single, decisive motion. I pulled out the crisp, white laboratory report. The document was dense with genetic markers, biological sequencing charts, and technical medical language, but I bypassed all of it and let my eyes fall directly to the bold, capitalized conclusion printed at the very bottom of the final page. Probability of paternity, Laurors Suksukoin. The biological samples provided from subject A do not share a paternal genetic relationship with the biological samples provided from subject B. The subject known as Bryce is excluded as the biological offspring of the subject known as Colin. I read the numbers again. 0.00%. No margin of error, no statistical anomaly, a complete, undeniable biological zero. The teenage boy I had loved, indulged, and groomed to inherit my $15 million empire was a total stranger. He did not carry a single drop of Hartley blood. Evelyn's sacred lineage, the family legacy we had sacrificed so much to build and protect, had died in the same breath as my wife's last one in that hospice bed. For exactly 1 minute, a crushing wave of grief broke over me. I mourned the grandchild I had lost. I mourned the deception that had robbed me of a true legacy. And I grieved for Evelyn, offering silent thanks to whatever higher power existed that she had been spared from ever witnessing this sickening betrayal. What I was about to uncover in those records was something I never fully prepared myself to see. The betrayal ran deeper than I imagined, and the people closest to me were at the center of it. Before we get there, tell me, if you discovered someone you loved had been quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and build your case in silence? But the grief didn't last. It was almost instantly incinerated, burned away by a cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying rage. The sorrow was swallowed whole by the sharp, focused clarity of a man who had just understood he was encircled by vicious predators. I folded the laboratory report cleanly in half and tucked it securely into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. My mind, hardened by decades of ruthless corporate warfare, began rapidly processing the new variables of the battlefield. If Colin was not the boy's biological father, then who was Serena? Was a highly calculating, fiercely ambitious woman. She would never risk her lavish, heavily subsidized lifestyle on some meaningless affair with a nobody. If she was going to commit an infidelity capable of destroying her lucrative marriage to the heir of a logistics empire, she would do it with someone useful. Someone who could actively advance her ultimate ambition of absolute financial control. She would choose a partner who understood precisely how to move massive sums of money without tripping internal corporate alarms. Someone with deep, unrestricted access to the financial architecture of Hartley Logistics. The realization struck me like a freight train at full speed. The missing $4.5 million drained from the employee pension fund, the phantom shell companies registered in Delaware, the frantic pre-dawn attempt to push a massive wire transfer through using my spoofed digital signature. Serena had not been running this massive corporate embezzlement alone. She had a highly skilled, deeply embedded partner on the inside. I pulled out of the medical clinic parking lot, my destination already fixed. I wasn't going back to the office. I wasn't going home. I was going to war, and I needed a soldier to help me gather my ammunition. I drove to a nondescript office building on the edge of the industrial district at the far rim of the city. I walked through the doors and into the spare utilitarian office of Garrett Velez. Garrett was a former federal agent, a man who had spent 20 years hunting white-collar criminals and dismantling organized syndicates before stepping into highly lucrative, strictly confidential private investigation. He was ruthless, strikingly efficient, and entirely free of moral hesitation when properly compensated. I dropped into the uncomfortable chair across from his metal desk. No pleasantries. I reached into my coat, pulled out my checkbook, and signed a blank check. I slid it across the desk, the amount line left completely empty. Garrett looked at the blank check, his dark eyes narrowing with quiet professional interest. I need you to unearth every shadow Serena ever cast, before and after she managed to marry my son. I told him, my voice hard and unyielding as cracked ice. Leave no stone unturned. I want to know where she spends her afternoons, what she's buying, and who she's meeting when she thinks no one is watching. I want her entire life stripped down and laid out in front of me. Garrett slowly picked up the blank check, a measured, knowing smile moving across his weathered face. Where would you like me to begin, Mr. Hartley? He asked quietly. I leaned forward, the cold fire burning steadily in my chest. Start with Clifford Drummond. I spent the next 3 days moving through my life like a ghost. I went to the office, sat through meetings, reviewed quarterly projections, as though the ground beneath me had not completely given way. I exchanged polite nods with Clifford Drummond in the corridor, offering the same calm, professional smile I'd worn for years. I returned Colin's increasingly anxious calls about the succession documents, assuring him in a tired, subdued voice that I simply needed a bit more time to put my affairs in order. Every word I spoke was a carefully measured performance. I was a man standing in the middle of a burning room, straightening his tie while quietly bolting every door from the inside. They believed they were witnessing a powerful man slowly dissolving into grief and irrelevance after losing his wife. They had no idea they were actually watching a predator quietly laying out his killing floor. On the evening of the third day, the burner phone buzzed. A single text from Garrett Velez, an address for a 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, and a specific time. I arrived 15 minutes early, easing my car into the dim, pothole-scarred parking lot. The diner was a relic from another decade, thick with the smell of stale fryer grease and cheap black coffee. Garrett was already positioned in a sticky vinyl booth deep in the back corner, shielded entirely from the large front windows. He was nursing a mug of black coffee, his face an unreadable mask of professional calm. As I slid into the seat across from him, he offered no greeting. He simply reached into his worn leather briefcase and drew out a thick, heavy navy blue folder. He pushed it slowly across the scarred laminate table until it came to rest against my folded hands. "You were absolutely right to start with Clifford Drummond, Mr. Hartley." Garrett said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that barely carried above the ambient hum of the diner's old refrigeration units. They were not especially careful. Arrogance rarely is. I stared at the thick dossier. My fingers rested lightly on the cover, feeling the dense weight of the secrets sealed inside. I opened it. The very first page was a high-resolution photograph, date-stamped just 3 weeks ago. It showed Serena and Clifford seated close in together at a secluded table in an upscale, out-of-town restaurant. Clifford was leaning in his hand, resting intimately over hers, their faces drawn close in private animated conversation. This was not a business meeting. The body language was unmistakable, two people sharing a deep, familiar, and carefully guarded history. They did not meet at Hartley Logistics during a corporate restructuring event 5 years ago, as they always claimed. Garrett said, tapping a thick stack of printed documents near the back of the folder. "I pulled their university records. They met 20 years ago at an out-of-state business college. They were college sweethearts. They shared a rented apartment together for 2 full years before graduation. When they recognized that neither of them had the family wealth to bankroll their ambitions, they apparently made a strategic decision to pursue more lucrative opportunities elsewhere." I turned through the pages, my eyes moving across hotel receipts, credit card statements, and private flight manifests, all painting a clear, irrefutable portrait of a continuous, highly coordinated 19-year affair. They had sustained their romantic and financial partnership throughout the entire time Serena had been engineering her way into Colin's life, and long after she had secured her foothold inside the Hartley family. "And the boy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though I already knew the answer. Garrett nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I secured a discrete biological sample from Clifford Drummond yesterday morning and expedited the genetic analysis against the data you previously obtained. Clifford Drummond is undeniably the biological father of Bryce. Serena was carrying his child before she ever walked down the aisle with your son. They essentially planted a cuckoo bird directly in your nest, Mr. Hartley, guaranteeing themselves a permanent biological anchor tied to your family's vast fortune." The revelation landed with sickening clarity. It was an extraordinarily long con, a 19-year strategic infiltration engineered to slowly drain the lifeblood from my empire. Serena had used my weak-willed son to gain access to the Hartley wealth, and had used her biological child with Clifford to ensure she held a permanent, unbreakable claim on the family inheritance. They had manipulated my love, my pride, and my hunger for a grandson to cement their ultimate financial security. But the true devastation, the absolute killing blow, was still waiting for me deeper in Garrett's meticulous investigation. Garrett reached across the table and slid out a single sheet of paper that had been paperclipped to a secondary file. This was the most difficult piece to extract, he said, his voice dropping even lower. I had to use some highly unconventional digital retrieval methods to pull it from a deleted archive server. But I felt it was essential that you saw the complete picture. He pushed the paper toward me. It was a printed copy of a private email date-stamped exactly 10 years ago, sent from a heavily encrypted private account belonging to Colin, addressed directly to Serena's personal email address. I looked down at the page and read the words. They burned into my retinas, obliterating the last surviving fragments of the family I believed I had known. I read the message, my heart hardening into a cold, leaden stone. To Serena, the email read, I got the results back from the specialist today. It's confirmed. I am completely sterile. The childhood infection caused permanent, irreversible damage. There is absolutely no chance of me ever fathering a child. We have to be incredibly careful. If my mother finds out, if she realizes I cannot provide a biological heir, she will invoke the bloodline clause in her trust. She will cut me out entirely and leave everything to charity. We have to keep up the illusion. My father must never know. Bryce is the only thing keeping my inheritance secure. The diner fell away. The smell of grease, the hum of the old refrigerators, the low murmur of the scattered patrons, all of it dissolved into a ringing, suffocating void. Colin knew. He had known for 10 years. He knew that Bryce was not his son, and he knew that Serena had brought another man's child into our family. But rather than facing that betrayal, rather than coming to me with the truth, my son had made a deliberate choice to become a willing accomplice to the deception. He had participated in this sustained, monstrous fraud because he was terrified, absolutely terrified, of losing his inheritance. Evelyn had always been fiercely protective of the Hartley legacy. She had insisted on a strict ironclad clause in our family trust, stipulating that the bulk of our corporate assets and personal wealth would pass only to direct biological descendants of the Hartley bloodline. She wanted to guarantee that the empire we had built from a single battered freight van back in 1983 would never be surrendered to opportunistic outsiders or predatory spouses. Colin knew about this clause. He knew that his sterility meant he could never satisfy his mother's firm requirement for inheritance of the trust. And so, driven by naked greed and a pathetic, cowardly desperation to preserve his comfortable life, he had struck a sordid bargain with Serena. He would raise another man's child, perform the role of the proud and devoted father, and actively deceive his own parents, all to protect his claim to a $15 million fortune. He sold his mother's honor and his father's trust for a monthly paycheck. He was not Serena's victim. He was a willing, fully engaged participant in a 19-year fraud. He had watched me lavish affection on a child who was not mine. He had watched me swell with pride over the boy I believed would carry my name into the future. And he had done it all while privately tallying exactly how much it would one day be worth to him. I sat in that vinyl booth staring at the printed email until the letters blurred into a meaningless, dark smear. The brief, sharp sorrow that had grazed me at the genetics clinic was gone now, completely gone. In its place was something cold, absolute, and terrifyingly precise. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was no longer a disappointed father. I was a man who had been marked for slaughter by the very people he had spent a lifetime building a world for. I folded the email carefully and returned it to the thick dossier. I closed the cover and pressed both hands flat against the navy blue folder. I raised my eyes to Garrett Velez, who was watching me with quiet, professional respect. He recognized the shift in my bearing. He could see the predator finally surface and take command. "Thank you for your exceptional work, Garrett." I said, my voice perfectly even and stripped of any human warmth. "Your investigation has given me exactly what I need to move forward." Garrett nodded slowly, turning his cold coffee mug in his hands. "What's your next move, Mr. Hartley?" he asked quietly. I rose from the sticky booth and tucked the heavy dossier firmly under my arm. "I'm going home, Garrett," I said, fastening my wool overcoat. "I'm going to invite my loving son and his devoted wife into my study, and I'm going to play the role of the broken, clueless old widower they so desperately need me to be. I'm going to give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves with." I drove back to the large, empty house, the thick dossier sitting heavily on the passenger seat. Streetlights swept past, throwing long, shifting shadows across the leather interior. My mind was a steel trap, cleanly compartmentalizing the profound, nauseating betrayal I had just laid bare. There would be time for rage later. There would be time to mourn the son I believed I had, and the grandson who was never truly mine. But right now, I needed absolute, unwavering focus. I needed to deliver a performance convincing enough to leave Serena and Colin completely blind to the executioner's blade hanging directly above their heads. I turned into my driveway, the gravel grinding sharply under the tires. The house was dark, exactly as I'd left it. I went straight to my private study. I secured the dossier in the hidden biometric safe beneath my desk, locking that explosive truth away alongside the encrypted hard drive holding the evidence of their massive corporate embezzlement. I picked up my burner phone and dialed Colin's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice drawn tight with manufactured concern and barely concealed anxiety over my long silence. "Dad," he said quickly, "are you all right? I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." I let out a long, ragged exhale, deliberately feeding a faint, fragile tremor into my voice. I coughed softly, bracing myself against the solid desk. "I'm sorry, Colin," I murmured, keeping my words thin and spent. "I've just been so incredibly tired. The grief, it's finally catching up with me. I feel like I'm being pulled under." I let the silence sit on the line, giving it time to breathe, ensuring he had fully absorbed the picture of a broken, defeated old man. "I think you and Serena should come over tonight. I've made a decision about the succession agreement." A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Of course, Dad," Colin replied, his voice shifting instantly into a smooth, practiced warmth. "We'll be right there. Don't worry about a single thing." I spent the next hour staging the study with care. I turned the overhead lights down low, letting deep, melancholic shadows pool in the corners. I placed a framed photograph of Evelyn at the center of my desk, angled so her bright, open smile would be the first thing anyone noticed walking through the door. I loosened my collar, ran a hand through my gray hair to leave it disheveled, and let my posture sag deliberately. I was a man who had assembled a $15 million logistics empire through sheer force of will and relentless negotiation. But tonight I would play the part of a hollow, crumbling widower who had finally buckled under the weight of his sorrow. When the brass doorbell rang, I did not hurry. I moved in slow, deliberate shuffles, leaning into the banister as I descended the grand staircase. I pulled open the heavy oak door. Colin and Serena stood on the stone porch, dressed in quietly expensive clothing, their faces arranged into careful expressions of deep, performative sympathy. "Dad," Colin said softly, stepping inside and folding his arms briefly around my shoulders in an awkward half-embrace. Serena followed a step behind, offering a tight, sympathetic smile, that did nothing to conceal the sharp, predatory glint lurking in her cold eyes. We made our way back to the study. I lowered myself heavily into the large leather chair behind the desk, letting my shoulders fold forward. I kept my hands on the desktop and allowed my fingers to tremble faintly, deliberately. Colin and Serena settled into the two leather chairs opposite me. I turned my gaze to Evelyn's photograph and let a long, agonizing silence open between us. I allowed one genuine tear drawn from the real, unperformed grief of losing my wife to surface and track slowly down my face. You were right, Serena. I finally whispered, my voice fracturing precisely on cue. I can't do this anymore. Without Evelyn, this house is nothing but a tomb. The company, the meetings, the relentless pressure, it's all just too much. I looked up and met her gaze with hollow, surrendered eyes. I'm exhausted. I just want to rest. I want to be left alone with my memories. Serena straightened in her chair, the triumphant greed practically radiating off her. She fought to hold her mask of polite sympathy in place, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her pulling upward in a barely restrained smirk. "Oh, Gerald," she cooed, her voice thick with artificial tenderness. "We understand completely. Grief is such a heavy, terrible thing to carry. You have given so many years to this company. It is time for you to step back and let us bear the weight. You deserve peace." Colin nodded vigorously beside her, reaching across the desk to cover my trembling hand with a show of hollow affection. "We're here for you, Dad. We'll handle everything. You don't have to worry about Hartley logistics ever again. We will protect the legacy you and Mom built." The sheer audacity of that lie, spoken while his hand covered mine, sent a shockwave of cold fury driving straight through my core. He was talking about protecting a legacy he had already auctioned off. He was talking about honoring a mother whose final days he had exploited as cover for massive corporate theft. I forced the bile back down my throat and made myself nod slowly, holding the illusion of complete surrender. "Draw up the final papers," I instructed, letting my voice sink to a weary, hollowed-out murmur. "Have the lawyers finalized the emergency handover? I will sign everything over to Bryce. I want him to hold the title in the family trust, just as you asked. You and Colin can manage the day-to-day operations. I just want it finished quickly. I want this weight lifted before the end of the week." Serena's eyes flew open with naked, unadulterated greed. The trap was snapping shut exactly as she had engineered it. She leaned forward in her chair, manicured fingers gripping the edge of my walnut conference table. "Shukr. We will have the documents finalized and ready for your signature by the Friday morning board meeting," she promised, her voice barely holding its composure. "We can execute the transfer officially before the entire executive committee. Clean, smooth, a seamless transfer of power." Colin smiled, a weak, spineless expression of relief spreading across his pale face. "Thank you, Dad. This is the right decision. We will make you proud. I guarantee it." I let them linger for another 20 minutes, enduring the hollow sympathy and their transparent attempts at reassurance. They talked about the company's future, about minor operational adjustments they planned to roll out, carefully steering well clear of any mention of the $4.5 million crater they had blasted through the employee pension fund. They were so utterly persuaded of their own genius, so completely certain they had outmaneuvered a grieving old man, that they failed to notice the absolute predatory stillness coiled just beneath my trembling exterior. They believed they were looking at a dying king surrendering his crown. They had no idea they were staring at an executioner setting the block. At last they rose to leave, eager to rush off and finalize their treacherous paperwork. I walked them to the front door, maintaining my shuffling, defeated gait. Colin embraced me again, murmuring hollow promises of family support. Serena offered a stiff, perfunctory hug, her mind already racing ahead to the Friday board meeting. I watched them descend the stone steps and fold themselves into their expensive luxury SUV, a vehicle purchased entirely on the back of my work. I stood on the porch in the cold night air and watched the red tail lights of their car swallow into the dark, winding street. The moment their vehicle disappeared from sight, the frail, trembling old man vanished completely. I straightened to my full-height shoulders, squaring spine locking into rigid, unyielding steel. The manufactured tremor in my hands evaporated instantly, replaced by absolute rock-solid steadiness. I stepped back inside the heavy oak door, swinging shut behind me with a hard, decisive thud. I strode purposefully down the hallway, the dim, melancholic lighting no longer touching me. I went back to my study, threw on the bright overhead lights, and reached for my secure burner phone. I didn't pause for a second. I dialed a number I had committed to memory decades ago. The line rang twice before a sharp, commanding voice came through. "Warren Aldrich speaking." Warren was my personal corporate attorney, 55 years old. A brilliant, merciless legal predator who had spent his entire career tearing rival companies to pieces in brutal courtroom warfare. He was a man who understood that real power was never exercised with warmth, but with a precisely honed legal scalpel. "Warren," I said, my voice shedding every trace of its weary pretense and returning to the hard, commanding register of the CEO who had built Hartley Logistics. "Clear your calendar for the rest of the week. I need you to construct a comprehensive dossier for termination and full disinheritance. We have a massive systemic breach of trust, multiple counts of serious financial fraud, and a critical violation of the Evelyn Hartley bloodline clause." A brief, sharp intake of breath on the other end. Warren did not ask for unnecessary details. He recognized the tone. He understood exactly what it meant. Who are the targets, Gerald?" he asked, his voice dropping all warmth and settling into cold, tactical precision. "My son Colin," I replied, my voice steady as granite. "My daughter-in-law Serena, and Clifford Drummond." I let those names settle heavily into the line. "They are staging a hostile takeover dressed up as an emergency succession, and they intend to use my signature to bury $4.5 million in stolen pension funds. They want the handover executed at Friday's board meeting." Warren gave a short, dry chuckle, low, humorless, the sound of a predator sizing up its prey. "That is remarkably ambitious of them. What are your specific instructions?" I fixed my gaze on Evelyn's framed photograph on my desk. Her bright, open face seemed to push me forward, demanding absolute justice for the legacy she had helped forge. "Prepare the financial audits, Warren. Coordinate with your contacts at the federal level on the embezzlement, and bring forward the full biological evidence." I leaned closer to the phone, my voice dropping to a deadly measured whisper. "We are going to let them take their seats at the head of the table on Friday morning. We are going to let them believe they have won. And then, Warren, we are going to obliterate them completely. It is time for a slaughter." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in human hubris. Convinced they had neutralized their final obstacle, Serena and Clifford threw caution aside entirely. Their arrogance bloomed into a blinding, intoxicating drug. Without waiting for a drop of ink to touch the succession documents, they immediately launched a systematic purge of Hartley Logistics, clearing out anyone who might dare question their authority. By Wednesday afternoon, I received a frantic, bewildered phone call from Leonard Quill, my fiercely loyal vice president of operations, who had stood beside me for 2 decades. He told me Clifford had walked into his office flanked by corporate security and handed him a severance package citing an immediate restructuring of the executive tier. Leonard was not the only casualty. Within 24 hours, they had also abruptly terminated my Director of Human Resources and my Chief Logistics Coordinator, replacing all three dedicated veterans with sycophantic, grossly underqualified lackeys, hand-picked personally by Clifford. These new appointments were nothing more than compliant rubber stamps brought in specifically to look the other way, while the corporate accounts continued to drain. Colin, the supposed heir apparent, did absolutely nothing to halt the brutal corporate massacre. He simply sat inside his pristine corner office, signing off on every termination authorization. Serena slid across his desk without him raising a single question. I told Leonard to accept his severance, quietly pack his belongings without making a scene, and take a short, well-earned rest. I told him in a voice that left no room for interpretation that he would be back in his rightful chair by Monday morning. He trusted me without reservation and walked out of that building with his head held high. I spent Thursday morning drifting through the hallways of my own company like an invisible ghost, playing the mournful role of the departing founder, taking one last look at his life's work. I moved slowly, shoulders caved, letting the staff absorb the image of the broken man the office rumors were already describing. Shortly before noon, I shuffled into my private corner office. The heavy door stood propped open, and two interior designers with digital measuring tape were actively cataloging the room's dimensions. Serena stood at the center of the space, gesturing at the dark wood paneling and issuing loud commands for it to be stripped and repainted in stark, sterile white. She was already measuring for her incoming imported Italian furniture, systematically erasing decades of history embedded in those walls. I stood quietly in the doorway and watched her wave a dismissive hand at the solid oak desk positioned near the wide bay windows. That desk was not furniture. It was the precise spot where Evelyn and I had sat side by side 30 years ago, toasting from paper cups of cheap champagne after signing our very first $1 million freight contract. We had wept together that evening, finally understanding that our desperate, grinding fight to build this company had secured a real and lasting future for our family. Serena glanced over and saw me in the doorway, offering a brief, patronizing smile. She told me not to worry, assured me they would carefully box up my personal items later that evening. I nodded, thanked her for her tremendous consideration, and turned away. As I walked from my desecrated sanctuary, I felt no anger, only a deep, chilling anticipation. While Serena was busy selecting expensive fabric swatches for her stolen throne, Warren Aldrich and I were already moving through the deep, unseen currents far beneath the surface. We had transformed my home study into a heavily fortified, fully encrypted war room. Warren moved with the cold, ruthless efficiency of an apex predator catching the scent of blood. He used a secured, encrypted server to open a direct line to Special Agent Fenton, a decorated veteran in the FBI's white-collar crime division, a man Warren had faced down in court on occasion, yet one he respected deeply for his absolute devotion to hard evidence. We handed over the digital key to the invisible back door I had buried inside the Hartley logistics servers. We gave the federal agents total unrestricted access to the sprawling maze of financial corruption. They spent Wednesday night and the whole of Thursday tracing the digital paper trail we had carefully illuminated for them. They watched in real time as Clifford and Serena drained the last of the employee pension funds through 4 ghost limited liability companies registered in Delaware. They confirmed the forged digital signatures, charted the offshore routing protocols, and secured warrants to freeze the illicit Cayman Islands accounts. What had begun as a corporate termination was no longer merely that. It had become a massive, fully coordinated federal sting operation. Special Agent Fenton personally guaranteed Warren that heavily armed teams would be locked into position in unmarked vans encircling the Hartley Logistics building by first light. The evidence of the $4.5 million embezzlement was entirely airtight, and the federal government was ready, more than ready, to collect. The sun finally broke on Friday morning, bathing the city in a cold, brilliant, merciless light. I stood at the center of my master bedroom, absorbing the complete and utter silence of the house. The season of playing the grief-hollowed, shattered old man was finished. That performance had done precisely what it needed to do, lulling my enemies into a deep, intoxicating fog of false security. I crossed to my spacious walk-in closet and moved past the dark, conservative morning suits I had been putting on all week. In their place, I drew out a perfectly tailored midnight blue bespoke suit with razor-sharp lapels. It was a corporate Titan's armor, the garment I reserved for the days I intended to dismantle my most formidable adversaries completely. I dressed with slow, deliberate care. I fastened the crisp white shirt, clicked the heavy platinum cufflinks into place, and knotted a deep navy silk tie in a perfect Windsor knot. I studied myself in the full-length mirror. The stooped, trembling widower was completely gone. The man staring back was the founder of Hartley Logistics, someone who had weathered economic collapses, ruthless rivals, and the profound devastation of losing the woman he loved most. I moved to the sturdy wooden nightstand, where Evelyn had left her favorite pearl necklace. I rested my fingers against the cool pearls, drawing quietly on her enduring memory. My focus held firm, my purpose entirely unshakable. This was not simply about protecting a vast fortune. This was about defending the sacred honor of the woman who had given everything to build this magnificent empire by my side. I turned from that quiet bedroom and walked with purpose down the grand staircase, my footsteps landing with a commanding rhythmic authority against the polished hardwood floors. I stepped into my dimly lit study, the very room where Serena and Colin had foolishly believed they had broken me just a few nights before. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. The heavy shadows that had once concealed my carefully rehearsed weakness now seemed to lean in around me, embracing what was coming. I reached into the hidden compartment of my heavy oak desk and drew out the tamper-proof envelope holding the genetic laboratory report. That crisp white document carried the absolute scientific truth about Bryce and his parentage, the ultimate weapon that would permanently sever their unearned claim to everything I had built. I folded it with care and slipped it into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket, settling it flat against my chest. I fastened my heavy silver watch around my wrist and checked the time. It was exactly 7 in the morning. The board meeting was set to begin in exactly 2 hours. The federal agents were already moving into position. The legal termination documents had been finalized and were waiting securely inside Warren's briefcase. The chessboard was perfectly arranged, and my arrogant opponents were marching their king straight into a fatal, inescapable trap without any awareness of what surrounded them. I walked out my front door, the sharp morning air flooding my lungs with a bracing, exhilarating clarity. I settled into the driver's seat, gripped the thick leather steering wheel, and turned the ignition over. I was going to walk into that boardroom and let them settle comfortably at the head of the long walnut conference table. I was going to let them look down at me fully convinced they had won the brutal war. I would give them a few fleeting moments of glorious, uncut triumph, and then I was going to burn every inch of their stolen world straight to the ground without a single shred of mercy. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of my quiet suburban driveway, watching the rising sun flare across the windshield. Today was not a day of mourning. Today was a day of absolute reckoning. The wicked had enjoyed their brief, reckless reign, and now the true master was coming to collect. The drive to corporate headquarters passed in a blur of familiar streets and morning traffic. My mind locked entirely on the execution ahead. I pulled into my designated parking space and stepped out into the cool air. I walked through the sliding glass doors of Hartley Logistics' spine, straight the fine fabric of my bespoke suit, draping flawlessly across my shoulders. The security guards and front desk receptionists, who had spent 2 days watching me shuffle through these halls like a shattered, defeated man, stared at me with open shock. The fragile, trembling widower was completely gone. I moved with confidence toward the private executive elevator, my hard leather shoes striking a crisp, rhythmic beat against the polished marble floor. Every step was a deliberate blow against the false reality my enemies had so carefully constructed. I pressed the top floor button and watched the digital display climb, carrying me toward the climax of this brutal corporate war. The heavy doors of the main boardroom were shut when I arrived. I did not knock. I simply pushed them open and walked in. The room was packed. Serena had staged an impressive theatrical audience for her grand moment. She occupied the head of the long, polished conference table seated in the very leather chair that had been mine for 3 decades. Immediately to her right sat my son Colin, looking visibly pale and perspiring beneath his expensive designer suit. To her left sat Clifford Drummond, the chief financial officer, wearing a smug and victorious grin that turned my stomach. Beside Clifford sat 18-year-old Bryce scrolling absently on his smartphone, entirely oblivious to the massive criminal conspiracy churning around him. The rest of the table was filled with the new, sycophantic executive hires Clifford had rushed in to replace my loyal veterans. They regarded me with a mixture of pity and arrogant dismissal, certain they were about to watch a dying king make his pathetic final surrender. I walked slowly toward the only remaining empty chair at the far opposite end of the table. I did not break eye contact with Serena once. I took my seat and laid my hands flat on the cool, polished wood. The room went completely still. The only sound was the faint, steady ticking of the antique mantel clock standing on the shelf. Serena leaned forward, lacing her manicured fingers together and planting her elbows on the table. She was radiating greedy, unrestrained triumph. She nodded to one of the new executives who scrambled quickly to push a thick navy blue folder down the length of the table. It glided smoothly across the polished surface and came to a stop directly in front of me. Resting on top of the legal paperwork was a heavy silver pen. "This is the final emergency handover and succession agreement," Serena announced, her voice carrying through the silent boardroom. The tone was sharp, commanding, utterly stripped of the syrupy false sympathy she had performed in my study just nights ago. The transition of executive power has already received full approval from the new board members seated in this room today. We have streamlined the legal process to guarantee a rapid, seamless transfer of all corporate assets and operational authority into the family trust. All that remains is your final authorization signature on the bottom line. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. Buried deep within those pages was the indemnification clause and the mandatory audit authorization, the legal machinery designed to frame me for the theft of $4.5 million from the employee pension fund. I raised my eyes back to Serena. She was done pretending to be a supportive family member. She was a predator, utterly certain her jaws were already locked around my throat. The mask was gone entirely. She leaned back in my leather chair, a cruel, mocking smile spreading slowly across her face. "Juan, now that the old woman is gone," Serena said, her voice laced with pure venom and unmistakable malice, "you will sign the company over to my son and go fend for yourself. You are completely finished here, Gerald. It is our turn now." The sheer, brutal audacity of those words hung in the stagnant air of the boardroom like a foul cloud. She had finally let the truth pour out of her, revealing the dark, rotted core of her decades-long deception. The new executives shifted uncomfortably, unsettled by her naked cruelty, but they held their tongues, fiercely loyal to their new, corrupt paymasters. Clifford Drummond let out a soft, self-satisfied chuckle and adjusted his silk tie with a gesture of pure arrogance. Bryce finally lifted his eyes from his smartphone, mildly confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy, then quickly dropped his gaze back to the glowing screen. I did not react to her vicious slight against my late wife. I held my face as an impenetrable wall of cold, hard stone. I slowly reached out and lifted the heavy silver pen resting on top of the legal folder. The cool, solid metal settled against my fingers. I held it loosely, letting the morning light catch the barrel. Then I turned and looked directly at Colin. This was the final threshold. He was a weak, cowardly man who had willingly participated in a sweeping, systemic fraud to protect an inheritance he had never earned. He had sat there and listened to his wife desecrate the memory of his recently deceased mother. But he was still my son. I stared into his anxious, perspiring face and offered him one last silent plea. A single fleeting window to be a man to speak up to, pull the brake before the federal hammer came down and crushed his entire existence. I weighted the silver pen suspended loosely in the quiet air. Colin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple working against his tight collar. He could read the piercing question written clearly in my eyes. He knew precisely what I was asking of him without a single word. For one brief, agonizing moment, I watched a genuine flicker of hesitation pass across his pale features, but the cowardice had taken root far too deep within him. The terror of surrendering his comfortable life completely overwhelmed whatever tattered remnants of basic decency still lived inside him. Colin made his choice. He broke eye contact, turned his head away from me, and stared blankly down at his polished leather shoes. The betrayal was complete. I slowly opened my fingers and let the silver pen go. The metal cylinder hit the walnut conference table with a sharp clatter that rang through the silent boardroom like a gavel strike. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I looked directly into Serena's expectant, arrogant eyes. "No," I said evenly and without heat. Before she could even begin to process the refusal, the heavy double doors of the boardroom exploded open. Warren Aldrich walked in, flanked on either side by two stone-faced federal agents in dark windbreakers. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. Warren did not pause for pleasantries. He offered no introduction for the two imposing agents who stepped in behind him, their dark jackets cutting a stark contrast against the plush corporate surroundings. He moved with the precise, calculated stride of a man who had come to deliver a sentence, walking directly toward the chopping block. The arrogant, triumphant smiles plastered across the faces of the newly appointed board members dissolved in an instant, swallowed whole by a thick wave of collective confusion. Warren bypassed the row of empty chairs entirely. He moved straight toward the head of the long, polished walnut conference table, halting just a few feet from where Serena sat frozen in my leather chair. He unclasped his sleek black briefcase with a sharp, metallic snap that sliced through the heavy silence of the room. He reached inside and drew out the thick, tamper-proof envelope containing the verified genetic laboratory report. With one smooth, practiced flick of his wrist, he sent the document skimming across the center of the polished wood. It slid cleanly across the reflective surface and came to rest directly between Serena and Colin. That crisp, white paper looked harmless enough, but I knew the truth sealed inside it was about to detonate their entire stolen reality. Warren buttoned his tailored suit jacket, his expression an impenetrable mask of pure, unyielding legal authority. Before anyone in that stunned room could draw breath enough to form a question, Warren spoke. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute attention and left no opening whatsoever for interruption. "I am legally representing Gerald Hartley in all matters concerning the execution of the Evelyn Hartley Trust and the corporate succession of Hartley Logistics. He announced, his cold gaze trained directly on Serena. The sealed document I have placed before you is a legally binding, independently verified genetic analysis. It was expedited and officially certified by a premier independent medical laboratory less than 48 hours ago. Warren did not wait for their trembling hands to reach for the envelope. He recited the devastating scientific conclusion entirely from memory, his enunciation precise and deliberately punishing. The biological samples analyzed yield a probability of paternity of exactly 0%. The subject, currently known as Bryce, is definitively and permanently excluded as the biological offspring of Colin Hartley. Those heavy words struck the boardroom like a physical shockwave. A profound, horrified gasp erupted from the far end of the table. I looked past Clifford and saw 18-year-old Bryce sitting completely rigid in his leather chair. His smartphone had finally slipped from his fingers onto the table. Every trace of color drained from his young face in an instant, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He turned his head, slowly fixing his wide, utterly terrified eyes on his mother, silently begging her to tear the claim apart and prove it impossible. Serena did not even look back at her devastated son. The arrogant, beautifully constructed smirk had shattered across her face into a hideous mask of absolute, undeniable panic. The confident predator who had just moments ago ordered me to go fend for myself was replaced in an instant by a cornered, desperate animal. Her mouth opened and closed without producing a sound, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as they hovered uselessly above the stark white envelope. She knew she had been caught completely, but her deceitful mind was still clawing frantically for some miraculous escape from the perfectly constructed trap closing around her. Seated right beside her, Clifford Drummond felt the full, crushing weight of his new reality settling onto his chest. The smug, victorious grin was wiped entirely from his sweating face. He could read the federal agent's presence with perfect clarity, and his deep financial knowledge told him exactly what was happening to his criminal enterprise in this moment. He pressed his sweating palms flat against the walnut table and shoved his heavy chair backward instinctively, lunging toward the door, or perhaps toward his private office and the incriminating digital servers waiting there. He barely made it halfway to his feet before one of the federal agents moved with terrifying speed. The agent surged forward and planted a massive iron-heavy hand firmly onto Clifford's expensive shoulder, driving the corrupt CFO back down hard into his seat. "Do not attempt to stand, sir," the agent said in a low, gravelly, and dangerous voice that carried the unmistakable promise of immediate physical consequence if the order was defied. Warren Aldrich did not spare the struggling financial officer so much as a glance. He kept his cold, steely gaze locked entirely on Serena. Under the strict, legally binding stipulations established by the late Evelyn Hartley, he continued, his powerful voice cutting through the rising panic filling the room with effortless precision. The legal transfer of any corporate assets, executive authority, or financial holdings is strictly, exclusively, and permanently bound to the direct, verifiable biological heirs of the Hartley bloodline. There are no exceptions. There are no exploitable loopholes, and there are no alternative interpretations of this foundational family trust document. Warren stepped deliberately closer to the table's edge and leaned forward slightly, ensuring his next words carried their full, inescapable weight. Because you have actively and maliciously engaged in a sweeping biological fraud designed to present this young man as a legitimate bloodline heir, the emergency handover and succession agreement currently sitting on this table is completely null and void. The entire corporate transfer is legally terminated, effective immediately. You have no legal standing in this company. You hold no executive authority, and you have no valid claim to a single penny of the Hartley family fortune. You are stripped of all corporate and familial power right here, right now. The legal checkmate Warren had just executed was absolute flawless and utterly unforgiving. The suffocating silence that followed his declaration pressed down on the room like a physical weight. Colin shot up from his leather chair as though he had been violently electrocuted. His pale face arranged itself into a rehearsed mask of theatrical outrage, his voice climbing high with a forced performance of personal betrayal. He jabbed a trembling finger at his terrified wife. His eyes stretched wide with manufactured disbelief. "How could you do this to me, Serena?" he cried frantically. "You made me raise another man's son. You used me to steal from my own family." He was desperate for the federal agents, and for me to believe he was a completely innocent man. He swung toward me, hands raised in a pitiful, pleading gesture, counterfeit tears building in his cowardly eyes. But I reached down and unlatched the heavy brass buckles of my leather briefcase. I was nowhere near finished with him. I pulled back the leather flap, the brass buckles snapping open with a sharp crack that rang across the boardroom. Colin was still on his feet across from me, arms held wide in a theatrical show of innocent devastation. He pressed his eyes tightly shut, squeezing out miserable tears that crawled down his pale cheeks. He was waiting for my comfort. He was waiting for his grieving father to rush around the table and fold the poor, deceived son into his arms. I did not move toward him. Instead, I reached into the body of my briefcase and drew out the heavy dossier that Garrett Velez had passed to me in that dingy roadside diner. I pulled the highlighted document from the top of the stack, the printed email from exactly 10 years ago, the incontestable digital record of his complete moral bankruptcy. I did not hand it to him gently. I pulled my arm back and threw the crisp paper squarely at his chest. The document struck his designer suit and fluttered down onto the polished walnut conference table, landing right beside the damning genetic laboratory report. "Do not dare play the victim with me," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, gravelly whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "You are a coward. You knew you were completely sterile. You have known for 10 long years, and you sold your own mother's sacred honor for a pathetic monthly paycheck." Colin looked down at the highlighted sheet resting on the wood. His false tears stopped dead drying up the instant his eyes landed on the page, as if a faucet had been violently twisted shut. He recognized the heavy black text. He recognized his own private email address printed clearly across the top. The last remnants of color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a hollow, ashen gray. Warren Aldrich, never one to let a devastating legal moment go unexploited, leaned forward and tapped the document with a steady finger. He read the most ruinous lines aloud for the full executive board to absorb. He recited Colin's own wretched words, laying bare how the childhood infection had left him permanently infertile, and how he had conspired actively with Serena to deceive Evelyn and secure his place within the family trust. The sickening truth settled over the room like a fog. Colin did not attempt to deny it. He made no move to claim the document was forged. His knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed back into his leather chair, every last shred of fight draining out of his weak, pampered body. He buried his face in his shaking hands and broke down completely. This was not the calculated, manipulative weeping of a few moments ago. This was the raw, ugly sobbing of a man who understood that his entire life had just been permanently demolished. "Dad, please," he choked between heavy, racking sobs. I was terrified. She made me do it. She told me Mom would cut me off completely and leave me with absolutely nothing. He thrust a shaking finger blindly toward his wife, desperate to offload the crushing weight of blame onto her shoulders. Serena turned her head and fixed him with a look of pure, unfiltered contempt. "Do not dare try to pin your pathetic cowardice on me," she screamed, her voice fracturing with furious panic. "You gladly took the money. You happily lived in the giant mansion and drove the luxury cars. You are a weak, miserable excuse for a man who could not even give me a child." She wrenched her venomous gaze away from her weeping husband and locked onto Clifford Drummond, still pinned to his seat by the looming federal agent. "This was supposed to be flawless, Clifford," she shrieked, her perfectly styled hair collapsing wildly around her face. "You promised me the digital tracks were completely covered. You promised me the old man would never look closely enough to find the offshore routing numbers." Clifford snarled back at her, his smooth and arrogant facade in complete ruins. "Do not put this entirely on me, you greedy sociopath," he screamed over the erupting chaos. "You were the one who demanded we accelerate the timeline. You were the one who pushed to drain the pension fund dry while his wife was dying in the hospice center because you could not wait to buy that ridiculous property in Pelham Bay. The unholy alliance they had spent 19 years carefully constructing collapsed with breathtaking speed into a venomous, shrieking wreck. They were no longer the polished corporate predators who had smugly plotted my downfall just days before. They were cornered rats tearing viciously at each other in a desperate and futile attempt to abandon the sinking ship. I sat back in my chair and watched them self-destruct with absolute zero empathy. My heart was a sealed, impenetrable vault. Watching their red, screaming faces, my mind drifted briefly to the brutal freight wars of the 1990s. Evelyn and I had faced down savage union strikes, relentless corporate espionage, and massive predatory logistics conglomerates that had actively tried to grind our small, struggling business into dust. We had endured countless sleepless nights navigating treacherous financial waters, armed with nothing beyond raw grit and an unbreakable loyalty to one another. I had stared down armed hijackers attempting to steal our cargo trucks on dark, deserted interstate highways. I had fought for every single dollar in my bank account with everything I had. These soft, pampered vultures never stood a genuine chance against a real predator. They believed corporate warfare was a matter of tailored suits and forged digital signatures executed safely from an air-conditioned corner office. They had catastrophically underestimated the deep and dangerous resilience of a man who had actually bled to build the very ground beneath their feet. The screaming in the boardroom swelled to a fever pitch. Colin was sobbing uncontrollably into his hands. Serena was hysterically hurling a glass pitcher in Clifford's direction, while he bellowed for legal representation and cursed her name in return. The newly appointed executive board members, the very people Clifford had recruited 2 days ago to serve as compliant rubber stamps for the embezzlement scheme, sat frozen in complete stunned silence. They watched their brief and lucrative careers dissolve before their eyes. 18-year-old Bryce simply stared at the chaos unfolding around him, his mouth hanging open as he slowly grasped that his entire identity, his immense wealth and his family history were nothing more than a finely calculated illusion. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. The collapse of their carefully maintained lie was a necessary cleansing. I looked toward the head of the table and gave a single nod. The federal agents stepped forward, their handcuffs catching the light. "Clifford Drummond, Serena Hart," the lead agent announced, his commanding voice silencing the room entirely. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and the criminal embezzlement of $4.5 million from the Hartley Logistics Employee Pension Fund. You have the right to remain completely silent." The harsh, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed with cold finality throughout the vast boardroom. The sound sliced through the lingering chaos, delivering a sudden and terrifying reality to the arrogant predators who had engineered my downfall. Serena did not surrender quietly, as the federal agent secured her wrists behind her back. She thrashed violently against his grip. Her tailored designer suit twisted and wrinkled as she kicked her expensive heels wildly against the carpeted floor. Her composure had evaporated, entirely replaced by the hysterical flailing of a spoiled child denied her ultimate prize. "You cannot do this to me!" she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. "I dedicated almost 20 years to this family. I managed your pathetic son. I gave you the illusion of a perfect legacy. I deserve half of this company. You owe me, Gerald. You owe me everything." I watched her performance with absolute unblinking detachment. The federal agents ignored her venomous outburst as they escorted her toward the double doors. Clifford Drummond offered no physical resistance whatsoever. The crushing reality of the federal indictment had obliterated whatever arrogance he had left. He walked with his head hung low, his face drained white, his silk tie hanging crookedly against his chest. He moved out in humiliating silence, a defeated man who understood his fraud had just cost him his life. The walnut doors swung shut, cutting off the last of Serena's fading screams. The sudden silence left behind was suffocating. The newly appointed executive board members quietly gathered their briefcases and slipped out through the side doors. I did not bother to stop them. They were merely symptoms, and I was focused entirely on excising the root. My eyes drifted back to where Colin sat hunched at the table's far end, both palms pressed against his face, body shuddering with wet, miserable sobs. He had watched his wife get hauled out of the room in handcuffs and hadn't lifted a single finger. I went back into my briefcase one last time and produced a single page of legal paper bearing the embossed seal of Warren Aldrich's firm. I made my way along the length of that polished table, each footstep ringing out in the now emptied room. I came to a halt right next to Colin's chair. No consoling hand on the shoulder. I simply let the page fall onto his lap and waited. He peeled his hands away from his face and squinted down at the document through red, tear-swollen eyes. The moment he registered the bold heading, the air left him in a sharp, pained gasp. An eviction notice legally binding, impossible to contest. "You have exactly 24 hours to collect your belongings from the house I purchased for you." I told him every word flat and cold. "The keys go on the kitchen counter. You will not step onto that property ever again. On top of that, your position at Hartley Logistics is gone permanently. Title, salary, benefits, all of it stripped away." Colin's head snapped up, his face wild with a terror he had never once imagined he would feel. "Dad, please." He choked out, his hands locked together, knuckles white. "Where do I even go from here? How am I supposed to live? I have absolutely nothing. Hatim, that is a consequence you set in motion a decade ago." I answered, my voice carrying all the give of a stone wall. "You had a choice 10 years back: stand by your mother's honor or sell it for a guaranteed inheritance. You chose the money because you lacked the spine to build something of your own. Warren has already filed the legal amendments with the trust. Your disinheritance is complete and irrevocable. Not 1 cent of my estate will ever reach your hands. Your employment is finished. Your lease is finished. And your place in my life is finished. Do not reach out to me. Not now, not ever." Colin folded forward, face buried in trembling hands, completely undone. I moved away without a backward glance. I had no interest in watching what was left of a man who had thrown away every gift he'd ever received. I shifted my focus across the room. Bryce, 18 years old, was still seated where he'd been through the whole ordeal, rigid with shock. He looked every bit as young and lost as he actually was. Everything he had assumed was his: the name, the wealth, the future had been torn away in a single morning. When his eyes found mine, they held a raw tangle of terror and bewilderment. He hadn't asked for any of this. He was the lie made flesh, but he was also the one person in the room who bore none of the guilt. I thought about the 18 years I had poured into that boy, raising him, as though my own blood ran through his veins. Hatred wasn't what I felt toward him, but every time I looked at his face, I saw nearly 2 decades of systematic deception staring back at me. He was not my heir. He was not my continuation. I moved toward him and stopped a few feet away. And Bryce, I need you to hear what I'm about to say. I told him, pulling my voice back from the hard edge I'd used on Colin, still firm, but no longer a blade. The crimes your mother and your biological father chose to commit are not yours to carry. You were brought into this deception without your knowledge or consent. But the Hartley name is no longer yours, and neither are the advantages that came with it. The world outside these walls does not come with the cushion you've known. You are going to have to earn your footing the hard way. The boy swallowed and gave a slow, heavy nod, the full weight of it pressing down on him visibly. I am not putting you out on the street with nothing. I continued, keeping a firm and deliberate distance between us. I will carry your full college tuition and cover your basic living costs for exactly 1 year. 12 months to locate part-time work, apply for student loans, and lay the groundwork for a life that belongs to you alone. Do not waste it. Once that year runs out, you will have no safety net left, none. Is that understood? Bryce gave another slow nod, one tear tracing a quiet path down his cheek. I understand, sir, he murmured. Thank you. He got to his feet, uncertain. Stiff picked up his backpack and walked out of the boardroom without a word, leaving behind a fortune he had spent his whole life believing was waiting for him. Colin shuffled out behind him, barely upright, a hollowed-out man, lurching toward a world he had never once prepared himself for. The walnut doors closed behind them with a quiet, final thud that sealed the enormous room in absolute stillness. I remained standing near the head of the table, the morning's carnage having burned itself out completely, leaving behind nothing but a ringing cathedral quiet. I surveyed the boardroom, this arena I had carved out of nothing, with my own 2 hands over a lifetime of sacrifice. Warren Aldrich emerged from the far side of the room, his black leather briefcase clipped shut at his side, crossing toward me with measured, unhurried steps. It is done, Gerald, he said quietly, his voice low and grounding in the silence. The malignant cancer has been surgically cut out of your company. I pulled in a long, slow breath and felt something enormous shift, 19 years of crushing weight, beginning at last to loosen its grip on my chest. Yes, Warren, the cancer is finally gone, I said, my voice holding steady. But the empire still needs to be rebuilt. 6 months rolled past from the day the storm swept through the corridors of Hartley Logistics. Federal justice is a slow-turning wheel, but when it finally stops, the result is absolute. I took my place in the hard oak pews of the federal courthouse and watched the last act of Serena and Clifford's breathtaking arrogance play out to its permanent conclusion. The judge, presiding, a humorless man who had no patience whatsoever for white-collar predators, delivered a scorching rebuke before pronouncing sentence. Serena and Clifford each received 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary on charges of wire fraud and grand embezzlement. Serena made no scene this time. She stood motionless, the couture wardrobe long gone, replaced by the bleak uniformity of prison-issue clothing. Every shred of the gilded existence she had clawed and deceived her way toward for the better part of 2 decades had dissolved without a trace. Clifford was beside her, gutted, expressionless, bearing no resemblance to the smug CFO who had once controlled the room. They were led from the courthouse floor in iron restraints cast permanently out of the world they had conspired to take from me. Colin's punishment wore a different face, but it was no less crushing. Severed entirely from Hartley money and ejected without ceremony from the pampered routine that had defined his entire adult life, he hit the ground without any of the tools needed to absorb the impact. I commissioned an independent investigator to look in on him once, just enough to confirm the eviction and disinheritance had held. What came back was a portrait of precisely the future his choices had earned him. Colin was living in a cramped, noisy apartment complex on the less desirable side of the city, struggling to make ends meet by working a grueling minimum-wage retail job at a local home improvement store. His uniform was a cheap polyester vest. His supervisors were decades younger. His days were spent hauling merchandise onto shelves in exchange for an hourly wage that barely covered his bills. The hard-won respect for honest work, something Evelyn and I had spent years trying to instill in him, had arrived at last, delivered not by wisdom, but by consequence. I had no pity to offer him. A man who broadcasts poisoned seeds should not be surprised by the harvest. With the conspirators consigned to their respective ruins, I channeled everything I had into undoing the damage they had ground into the bones of my company. Rebuilding Hartley Logistics demanded the same bone-deep stubbornness that had originally raised it from a single battered freight van back in 1983. My first move as restored chief executive was to get Leonard Quill and the other veterans on the phone, the loyal, experienced leaders Serena had discarded during her brief and contemptible takeover. I brought them back personally, restoring their former roles and pairing the offer with meaningful financial bonuses and a genuine apology for the upheaval they had been dragged through. Not one of them hesitated. They came back, slid straight into their positions, and helped me pull the company back from the edge. Working shoulder to shoulder with Special Agent Fenton and the federal investigative team, we tracked every stolen dollar through the convoluted web of offshore routing protocols, a painstaking and exhausting process. But Warren Aldrich's legal precision ensured the frozen Cayman Islands accounts were unlocked and the funds repatriated without delay. Every cent of the $4.5 million Clifford and Serena had bled from the employee pension fund was recovered in full. I took direct personal charge of transferring those recovered funds back into the employee pension accounts, making certain that every hard-working man and woman who formed the backbone of Hartley Logistics would not lose so much as a fraction of the retirement security they had earned. The morning the restoration was complete, I called the entire company together, standing before hundreds of my people to tell them plainly that the storm had passed and their futures were secure. Looking out across that sea of relieved faces, I felt the heavy, suffocating darkness of the past 6 months begin at last to loosen its grip on my shoulders. The malignant cancer had been cut out permanently, and the healing was taking hold. But fully restoring my company demanded far more than reconciling financial ledgers and bringing loyal staff back through the door. It called for the fundamental restructuring of the Hartley legacy itself. I had to guarantee that the kind of bottomless greed that had poisoned my own family could never again be used as a weapon against the magnificent empire Evelyn and I had given everything to build. On a crisp, brilliantly clear Tuesday morning, I rode the private elevator all the way up to the roof of Hartley Logistics headquarters. The rooftop stretched wide, offering a sweeping panoramic view of the city skyline, a sprawling, relentless metropolis that my delivery fleet crossed every single day. The cold morning wind cut sharply at my suit jacket, but a deep, steady warmth radiated from somewhere inside my chest. Warren Aldrich stood quietly at my side holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio packed with the finalized legal documents that would permanently reshape the disposition of my fortune. He extended the heavy silver pen toward me. I took it without a moment's pause. I set the documents on a small glass table we had carried up to the roof and signed my name in clean, deliberate strokes. I was formally executing a brand new ironclad trust agreement. 50% of my entire personal wealth and corporate holdings were transferred instantly into the newly established Evelyn Hartley Scholarship Fund, a sweeping philanthropic initiative built specifically to provide full university scholarships and comprehensive living stipends to gifted young people from underprivileged backgrounds who carried the drive to succeed but had never been handed the financial means to do so. Evelyn had believed in the transformative power of education with everything she had. She understood the dignity that came from honest, hard-earned achievement. This fund would make her memory permanent, binding her name forever to profound generosity, rather than to the corrosive greed of the woman who had once called herself our daughter-in-law. The remaining 50% of the company was irrevocably placed into an employee stock ownership program. The wealth accumulated inside Hartley Logistics would not be passed down to some entitled, ungrateful heir. It would flow steadily to the truck drivers who logged the miles, the warehouse managers who ran on too little sleep, and the loyal executives who had genuinely bled to build this place beside me. They were the true architects of everything this company had become, and they had earned the right to share in its rewards. I stood near the edge of that rooftop, gazing out at the city spreading endlessly before me. Family is not determined by blood. It is certainly not decided by a marriage certificate. It is forged through absolute and unwavering loyalty. A lone wolf may lose his mate, but he never ever loses his teeth. And that is where this story comes to rest, not in bitterness, but in something harder won than revenge. It took everything to get here. The road back from that kind of betrayal is not a straight one. I lost nearly 2 decades to a lie that lived inside my own household, wore my name, and sat at my table. I believe God does not allow that kind of darkness to go unanswered forever, and in His timing, every hidden thing eventually finds the light. What it cost me, no ledger can fully measure, but what it taught me is worth passing on. First, pay attention to what does not add up. Small inconsistencies are rarely accidents. They are the edges of larger truths trying to surface. Do not dismiss them. Second, loyalty is earned through action, not through blood or legal documents. When someone shows you who they are under pressure, believe them completely. Third, if you are building something real, protect it with the same intensity you used to create it. Complacency is the door that predators walk through. Fourth, when the time comes to act decisively. Half measures only extend the damage. If this story moved you, if any part of it reminded you of your own life or someone you care about, I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this one about holding the line, protecting what matters, and refusing to be counted out, please pass it along to them. That is why Dad Revenge exists. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until the next story, take care of yourself and take care of the people who have truly earned your trust.